Hey, so maybe you could share with us a little bit, Mark, some of the history of the two great composers we're going to be listening to today and sort of their involvement, experience, how they came to, and I'm of course speaking of Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith, to score numerous episodes of The Twilight Zone. And
Yep.
anything you might want to share with us about those composers and their involvement on the show.
Yeah, well, Twilight Zone debuted in 1959 and ran through 1964, did 156 episodes, 92 of them written by Rod Serling himself. And he was really the first showrunner in the modern sense of the term, a writer who created the show, ran it. It was very much his aesthetic, very much his say in terms of what got made, what got presented to the public. This is back when there were only three television networks. So the guys who headed up those three networks pretty much were responsible for all television coming through the entire population of America and in syndication around the world. So it was an amazing time, a great time of opportunity because you had the fading era, golden age of Hollywood. So you had actors, writers, directors, producers, and composers coming off of that amazing time. Then you also had young musicians, young composers, young actors, etc., who were just on the rise. So so it was perfect. So Twilight Zone, and because Rod Serling had wanted to be a mainstream writer, but censorship stopped him. He was the most lauded writer in television at that time, coming off Playhouse 90 and things like that. But he wanted to talk about race. He wanted to talk about, all sorts of issues, social issues that were happening. He was censored, so he thought, well, if I come up with a science fiction show, maybe I can slide these issues past the censors. If I put it on Mars, they won't know that I'm talking about, Mississippi, or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and it worked. It worked. But because he was such a phenomenal writer, and the other writers that he brought aboard, Twilight Zone, Richard Matheson, George Clayton Johnson, Charles Beaumont, Ray Bradbury, were also phenomenal writers. That basically had a ripple effect. And when I talked to Buck Houghton, who was the producer of the first three seasons of Twilight Zone, I said, "How did you get this amazing talent pool?" They had like great movie stars. They had Robert Redford, they had Lee Marvin, they had all these amazing people, and the composers like Bernard Herrmann, as you mentioned. He said, "Well, it all started with the word. They would read these scripts by Rod Serling, and he was bringing such an A game to this material that they would bring their A game." And so I think the scores that I mean, you got Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith, and as we said, Marius Constant and Franz Waxman, from the golden age of Hollywood. And at that time, Bernard Herrmann already was one of the greatest composers to ever work in film. I mean, he was already coming off, Citizen Kane and Vertigo and all of those amazing scores. And Jerry Goldsmith was just on the ascendant, so he would
Yeah.
have an astonishing career ahead of him. But
Yeah.
the fascinating thing was that they were working in television, and so this allowed them, in some cases, to sort of try out ideas that would later be seen in their scores and features later on. So, for instance, with Bernard Herrmann, you see in some of his scores for Twilight Zone, um, interesting arrangements and tonalities that you would later see in scores like Fahrenheit 451 and some of the stuff he did for the Harryhausen films. And with Jerry Goldsmith, that percussive kind of score that he would do for the Twilight Zone themes, you would later see in things like Planet of the Apes, which, interestingly enough, Rod Serling co-wrote.
Yes.
And and it was interesting because they would be dealing with a much smaller ensemble of musicians. They wouldn't have a full orchestra like they would on a big feature. But the amazing thing was, I think these scores absolutely stand up with the best of the work of any of these composers in features. I think the fact they were not limited by having a small number of musicians, it presented a very interesting artistic challenge that they certainly met. And so that was really, really fascinating.